I'm Elliot, and I used to think success was all about money. As a real estate developer, I thrived on transforming landscapes and turning empty lots into expensive buildings. But when I was an assistant director, I couldn't stop thinking about how busy Testament would be. My latest project, a deluxe shopping mall, was going to be my masterpiece. But there was a problem. An old house, smack in the middle of my prime location. The owner, Joe, was an elderly man who stubbornly refused to sell. I tried everything to reason with him. I offered him a more than generous amount for the land, and when that didn't work, I used a bit of intimidation. After all, I had connections with the mayor. "Please stop," he begged, his voice cracking. "This house is all I have left. It's my only treasured memory. Don't make me homeless. I have nowhere to go." His words hit deep, but I had deadlines, investors breathing down my neck, and a reputation to maintain. Sentimentality couldn't play a part here. The mayor eventually approved the rezoning of the land, so Joe would have to go, regardless of whether he accepted my money or not. "Look here, old man. I'm bringing this thing down in 2 weeks. All you've got to do is pack your stuff," I said when I visited again. But I left quickly, refusing to hear another word from him. As expected, I got what I wanted. Demolition Day was a spectacle. The roar of machinery, crashing bricks, and dust clouding the air were signs of my victory. Getting rid of that old thorn was so easy, I thought as I walked through the debris. Then I saw it. A broken picture frame with a faded photo. It was a young woman holding a baby. More specifically, it was my mother and me. "What is it doing here?" I gasped, grabbing it with trembling hands. What was our old picture doing in this old man's house? Then, a vague memory came. While raising me alone, she had sometimes spoken of a kind stranger who helped her during her darkest hours. She never forgot that man, even through the sickness that took her life. But apparently I did. Could this be him? The man whose life I'd just destroyed? Why didn't I remember him? Guilt and fear ran through my mind, so I called some people, pulled several strings, and discovered that Joe had relocated to a nursing home after I forced him out of his property. "What are you doing here?" he rasped when he saw me, his eyes filled with pain. "Did you come here to gloat?" I knelt beside him, shaking my head. "No, Joe, I found this." I held the picture up. His expression softened. "Samantha," he sighed, a wistful smile gracing his lips. "She was like a daughter to me." Then he told me how he'd found my mother, abandoned and destitute in the rain, with me in her arms. He gave her shelter and helped her rebuild her life. She and I lived in the house I'd just destroyed for 5 years. This meant that Joe and his old home were the reason I was standing there, successful and wealthy. What's more, I'd repaid his past kindness with cruelty. Shame burned through me. But I had a chance to make things right. The next day, I halted the mall project. After, I reworked things with lawyers, the mayor, and the investors. It took a lot of convincing, but it was for the best in the end. Soon, I had Joe's house rebuilt, brick by brick, more beautiful than before. Then I presented it to him, while begging his forgiveness. "I forgive you, Elliot," he said, his eyes filled with compassion. "You saw your errors and started to make amends. Your mother would be proud." Afterward, I became a frequent visitor at Joe's house, and as I learned from his wisdom, I changed my ways. Aside from lucrative pursuits, which I made sure never displaced honest people from their homes, I also worked with non-profit organizations. Together, we rebuilt and renovated homes within the community. This was how I learned that success was more than just projects and numbers in my bank account. It was also about the impact you left on the world. Girl's entire life turns upside down when she discovers who her real mother is. My mum was always seriously strict, so when my BFF Stacy invited me to her party, I knew I had to devise a plan. I mean, I was almost 16. All my friends went to parties. So I tried reasoning with her. I reminded her about my awesome grades, how I helped around the house, and how I was basically the perfect daughter. But she wasn't buying it. "No," she said before I even finished asking. My dad, as usual, was no help. He always sided with her. Frustrated, I blurted out, if Meredith were here, she would support me. Meredith was my older sister and my rock. But Mum simply told me to go to my room and have my tantrum there. I was so mad I slammed the door, but once inside I knew one thing. I wasn't giving up. I was going to that party. Later that night, after my parents went to bed, I snuck out through the garage. I'd done it 1,000,000 times before, but this time I bumped into a shelf and knocked some stuff over. As I was picking things up, panicking, an unfamiliar photo caught my eye. It was Meredith, but she looked about my age. And she was pregnant. My mind raced. Where was this child? My niece or nephew? Then it hit me. Could she be my... No, that wasn't possible. Shaking my head, I shoved the photo in my pocket. I had to get to Stacy's. This could wait. The party was awesome. Everyone was dancing and having fun. But then someone yelled, "Cops!" It was total chaos. In the confusion, I ran straight into a police officer on my way out. To make matters worse, he took a whiff of my breath and put me in the back of a squad car. At the police station, I called Meredith. I couldn't call my parents. They couldn't call me. Meredith was super annoyed about having to drive to the station and pick me up, but she still came. Once I saw her, I was reminded of the photo in my pocket. So, in the car, I showed it to her. "Oh boy," she said, her eyes wide. "Wait, are you pregnant in this photo? And where is the baby?" I asked, tilting my head. Meredith sighed. "We need to talk, but Mum and Dad should be there for this." "Just tell me," I begged, but she shook her head and kept driving. We pulled into Mum and Dad's driveway and I saw they were already awake. They must have noticed I wasn't in my room, or perhaps Meredith had called them before picking me up. Anyway, she rushed out and said it's time for her to know. "Know what?" Dad asked. "That I'm her mother," Meredith responded. "What do you mean you're my mother?" I screamed even though I'd suspected it earlier. No one even looked at me. Instead, everyone started yelling. My mum was furious at Meredith for telling me. Meanwhile, I was furious at all of them for lying to me my whole life, so I started yelling too. At one point, I couldn't take it anymore, so I ran. I ended up at the river near my house. It was my childhood escape. That day, I cried and cried until Meredith found me. "Oh, didn't you ever tell me?" I asked between sobs. She explained that she was only 15 when she had me, and my mum wanted to keep it a secret so she could have a good future. Meredith had always wanted to tell me, but was afraid that Mum and Dad wouldn't support her. After hearing her story and her pain, I realized that I was still angry, but I understood her side. I even understood then why Mum, my grandmother, had always been so strict. "Can you forgive me?" she asked. "I'll try to stop being your sister and start being your mum." I nodded. "So, should I start calling you Mum?" I asked. managing a small smile to lighten the mood. "Only if you call Mum Grandma, she'll be furious," Meredith joked. We laughed, and some of the tension finally eased. We had a long road ahead of us, but at least we had each other. A boy screams every time he sees old family photo until Mum looks at it closer. It's been a year since my son Adam's kidnapping, and while we got him back, it feels like a part of him is still missing. He barely speaks, his smiles are fleeting, and those big expressive eyes are often filled with a terror I can't understand. One dinner with my husband Jake, his big brother Steve, and his wife Gina became another painful reminder of how different things were. We were looking at old photos when I called out to Adam, "Look, these are your grandparents." I lifted the photo so he could see it better. But his reaction was completely unexpected. He burst into tears and covered his eyes. It was a simple picture of his young grandparents enjoying dinner, but it triggered him to a point I couldn't understand. Still, I comforted him and sent him to his room. Later, Gina found me in the kitchen with tears still slipping down my cheeks as I scrubbed dishes. "No progress?" she asked gently. I shook my head. The doctor says the trauma was severe. We've tried therapists, but he just shuts down. I remembered the awful day he was taken, the ransom call and our race to get the money. Sometime after we'd delivered the money, the police found Adam abandoned by the side of the road. Yet, the kidnappers were never caught. I can understand the trauma, but it's always that photo, I confessed to Gina. I've been trying to show it to him sporadically to see if he's getting better, or if he tells us the issue, like exposure therapy. But every time he sees it, he freaks out. Gina didn't have to say, but she could sympathize. When she and Steve left, Jake and I went to Adam's room. He still refused to speak. And just as I was losing hope, my husband had an idea. He sat down next to our son and told him that all parents are superheroes. We would never let anything or anyone hurt him again. After all, we saved him before. Adam nodded, and Jake told me to get the photo. Our son started crying, but with gentle coaxing and assurances, we finally got him to look at the image. We begged him to tell us what was wrong. To our surprise, his trembling finger lifted, and he pointed to the painting hanging on the wall behind his grandparents in that old photograph. It depicted a farm. His face twisted again, but we told him he had done a fantastic job. Then I had an idea. I grabbed one of his storybooks and said, "How about you use the words and letters in here to tell Daddy and Mummy what you're scared of?" Surprisingly, it worked. Adam began picking out letters with interest. First, he stopped on a page and pointed to the letter I. "Good job, champ. Keep going," Jake encouraged, and Adam pointed to the word here. Then his finger went back to the painting hanging behind his grandparents in the photo. He looked up at both of us, terrified again. I realized with horror what he was trying to say. It was probably my maternal intuition. What if he'd been held captive in the place depicted in that painting? Just in case, I asked, and he nodded, terrified.